the National Broadcasting Company and the American Association of Colleges for Teacher Education, in cooperation with the American Political Science Association and the National Council for the Social Studies, present Continental Classroom, a course in the structure and functions of American government. Conducted by Dr. Peter H. Odegard, Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Odegard.
As I said the other day, the steel seizure case that we discussed raises in a dramatic and specific form the scope of executive power of the President and also the powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief. Now, theoretically, and for a long time, it was held that the powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief were purely military. To be sure, the President had control over and could direct the armed forces, particularly in time of war. He chose the officers, he appointed the major officers by and with the advice and consent of the Senate. As you see in this picture, President Truman with General MacArthur, whom he designated as our commander in Korea, and whom incidentally he later fired, because the President giveth and the President taketh away in this case. But the question of how far beyond a mere military use of the armed forces the President may go in using his powers as Commander-in-Chief in other cases. Now, he acts here under an authority of the Constitution in Article 2, Section 4, where you find, or rather, I beg your pardon, this should be Article 4, Section 4. This is a misprint, where it reads, "The United States shall guarantee to every state in the Union a republican form of government and shall protect each of them against invasion and on application of the legislature or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence." Presumably this would allow the President to send armed forces into any state to put down domestic violence. Now, the fact is that these provisions of the Constitution have been pretty much a dead letter for a long time. And the President's power to send troops into a state has been derived from another doctrine handed down by the court in a number of cases, most importantly in the case of In re Debs in 1895, when the court said that the President had power to use the armed forces and the entire strength of the nation, as they said, to enforce in any part of the land the full and free exercise of all national powers and the security of all rights guaranteed in the Constitution. That is, the President has power to use the armed forces of the United States to carry out his duties as executive to see that the laws are faithfully executed. Now, this power coming from the Constitution has been supplemented and reinforced by acts of Congress reaching back to May 1792 and coming down to the War Powers Acts of 1941 and 42. And the President has used troops in many controversial cases on the theory that he can use the entire force of the nation to quell domestic violence and to protect the property of the United States and even to remove obstructions to the mails. It was under this authority that President Washington in 1794 called out 15,000 troops to put down the so-called Whiskey Rebellion. It was under this theory, as we've seen, that Abraham Lincoln fought the whole Civil War. The whole purpose of the armed mobilization of the nation at that time was, according to Lincoln, for the purpose of enforcing the laws of the United States in the states that were then in rebellion. And in 1894, President Cleveland sent troops into the city of Chicago at the time of a bitter strike between the American Railway Union under Eugene Debs' leadership and the Pullman Company. And he sent troops into Chicago over the vehement protest of the governor of the state. Not only did the governor not ask for the troops, but he protested against their being sent. And this was sustained by the Supreme Court as a legitimate exercise of the President's power to quell violence, to protect the property of the United States, and to prevent obstruction to the mails. Actually, you know, between 1917 and 1922, a period of 5 years, federal soldiers were ordered into the states no less than 30 times, mainly in cases involving labor disputes. And in June 1941, 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order to his Secretary of War, Stimson, ordering him to seize the North American aviation plant at Inglewood, California, where a strike was in force, in order to keep the production of aircraft going. And here you see the troops of the United States moving in to occupy the North American Aviation Company at that time. Incidentally, the Attorney General who justified this order was Robert Jackson, who said at that time that the order was entirely valid and grew out of the President's inherent constitutional powers to exert his civil and military as well as his moral authority to keep the defense efforts of the United States a going concern, end quote. This was the same Robert Jackson who later, as a justice of the Supreme Court, held in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company case that Mr. Truman's order to seize the steel industry to prevent a steel strike in 1952 was an unconstitutional act. And again, you will remember that in September 1957, President Eisenhower sent paratroopers, as you see in this picture, into Little Rock, Arkansas, to enforce an order of a federal court requiring the racial integration of students in the public schools of that state and city. Now, if the President may thus use the armed forces in normal times of peace, what about times of emergency or war? It was Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers who argued, and I quote, that the direction of war implies the direction of the common strength of the nation as a usual and essential part of the executive authority, end quote. Now, if to employ and direct the common strength of the nation is within the power of the President as Commander-in-Chief, what, one may ask, may he not do? How far this may go is illustrated on February 19th, 1942, when President Franklin Roosevelt issued an executive order to the Secretary of War and to the military commanders on the West Coast, authorizing them to arrest, to take into custody 112,000 Japanese residents or residents of Japanese descent, 2/3 of whom were citizens of the United States, native-born, to remove them from their farms and their homes and transport them, as you see them being rounded up here, and located in what were called relocation camps in desert areas in these western states. And Congress ratified this act, and the Supreme Court of the United States, in a case coming up in 1944, also held it to be within the power of the President to issue such an order in the case of Korematsu against the United States. Again, in September 1942, Franklin Roosevelt appeared before the Congress of the United States and asked them to repeal certain provisions of the Price Control Act. And he said to them, I ask the Congress, he said, to take this action by the 1st of October. Inaction on your part by that date will leave me with an inescapable responsibility to see to it that the war effort is no longer imperiled by threat of economic chaos. In the event that Congress should fail to act, said the President, I will act. The President, he went on to say, has the power under the Constitution to take measures necessary to avert a disaster which would interfere with the winning of the war. And when the war is won, the powers under which I act will automatically revert to the people to whom they belong. And Congress complied. Time and again during World War II, President Roosevelt took action as Commander-in-Chief that normally would have had to wait on congressional authorization. He set up innumerable boards and commissions. He set up an Office of Emergency Management, a Board of Economic Warfare, a War Labor Board, an Office of Censorship, an Office of War Information, a War Production Board, and so on and so forth. Thus, the President's powers as Commander-in-Chief in war, never successfully challenged, almost literally embraced the full power which Hamilton had claimed to employ the common strength of the nation in this enterprise. One might ask then, what are the dimensions of the President's power as Commander-in-Chief? I think the honest answer to that is that nobody knows. It is, as thus far, not completely explored. The Supreme Court has imposed limits on this power in 3 cases at least that are worthy of mention. Back in 1866, the Supreme Court held that an order of President Lincoln's during the Civil War suspending the writ of habeas corpus in certain areas not occupied by troops was unconstitutional. Again, in the case of Duncan against Kahanamoku in 1946, the Supreme Court held that an order of the governor of Hawaii and the President setting up martial law in Hawaii was also unconstitutional. And as you know, in 1952, in the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company against Sawyer, the court held that President Truman's seizure of the steel industry to prevent a strike was also unconstitutional. But the powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief, even within the limits set by these Supreme Court cases, give him an authority in times of crisis or emergency that can only be compared to the powers of a Roman dictator of ancient times. Now, in foreign affairs, the President's position as Commander-in-Chief is strengthened by his power and responsibility as the sole voice of the nation in dealing with other nations. Thus, President Truman, you'll remember, without waiting for Congress to act, dispatched American military forces into Korea in June 1950 as a necessary part of American foreign policy to support the United Nations and to resist aggression. In 1866, President Johnson ordered 50,000 soldiers to the Mexican border to support an ultimatum that had been delivered by Secretary Seward to Louis Napoleon, demanding that the French withdraw their forces from Mexico. President Theodore Roosevelt sent warships to Panama in 1903 to maintain what he called free and uninterrupted transit across the isthmus. And in 1916, as you see in these pictures, President Wilson called 150,000 militiamen into national service, sent them down to the Mexican border, and then followed this act by sending an expeditionary force of 15,000 men under the command of General Pershing into Mexico itself in pursuit of a Mexican bandit, Pancho Villa. One wonders what our reaction would be if the Mexican president were to send an expeditionary force into the United States. And in June 1940, President Franklin Roosevelt entered into an agreement with Great Britain by which he turned over to the British 50 destroyers, so-called overage destroyers, in exchange for long-term leases on air and naval bases in the British West Indies. Now, the elaborate system of mutual security that is developed in our vast system of bases around the world points up again the tremendously important relation between the foreign policy of the United States and the powers of the President as Commander-in-Chief. Now, the President's powers as Commander-in-Chief in domestic affairs are incidental to his powers to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So, in foreign affairs, his command of the armed forces is but one instrument in his overall responsibility for the conduct of foreign relations. In this area, as in others, the President derives his power both from the Constitution and from acts of Congress. After all, much of his power depends upon congressional appropriations for the armed forces, congressional acts affecting tariff rates, fiscal policy, and so on, upon appropriations of the Congress for the USIA, foreign aid, the Peace Corps, Foreign Service, and all this, so that Congress, in all these ways, can help or hinder the President in his conduct of foreign policy. But the President derives much of his power without reference to Congress from the Constitution itself. He has power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties. He has power to nominate, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, appoint ambassadors and other public ministers and consuls. The Constitution says he shall receive ambassadors and other public ministers. And it's interesting to note in this connection that although the President, in nominating ambassadors, must do so by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, he can appoint ambassadors of his own without ever submitting their names to the Senate. Mr. Wilson, for example, used Colonel House, and Colonel House had much more power than any other ambassador. Yet he was never approved by the Senate. So too Franklin Roosevelt used Harry Hopkins, and so Mr. Truman used Mr. Herron as ambassador, and Mr. Kennedy has his own personal ambassadors around the world without reference to ratification or confirmation by the Senate. Now, in making treaties, it's important to remember that although 2/3 of the Senate must give advice and consent, treaties are made by the President. The Senate has no part in the negotiation or the making of the treaty. Furthermore, a long line of decisions has held that treaties, like acts of Congress and the Constitution itself, are the supreme law of the land and are binding upon both federal and state courts, anything in the Constitution or laws of the states to the contrary notwithstanding. It has been held time and again that when an act of a state is in conflict with a treaty of the United States, the act of the state must give way to the treaty. Some years ago, Congress undertook to regulate the flight of migratory birds across this country as a conservation measure. And this act was held to be unconstitutional by a lower court on the ground that this was a power reserved to the states. Whereupon the President of the United States entered into a treaty with Great Britain, under which he agreed on the part of the United States, and the British government agreed on its part, to protect migratory birds in flight from Canada across this country. And this treaty was then followed by an act of Congress to implement the treaty, and the treaty was attacked before the Supreme Court of the United States on the ground that a treaty could not invade the rights of the states. The Supreme Court, in a famous case of Missouri against Holland, decided in 1920, held that this act had been passed and put into effect as a result of a treaty between the United States and was therefore valid. And Justice Holmes, in his opinion for the court, distinguished between acts of Congress and treaties, because what this decision seemed to say is that Congress might do something, might legislate under a treaty in a way that it could not legislate in the absence of a treaty. And Justice Holmes said, acts of Congress, he said, are the supreme law of the land when made in pursuance of the Constitution, while treaties are declared to be the supreme law of the land when made under the authority of the United States. Now, does this language mean that treaties occupy a higher position in the hierarchy of law than acts of Congress? Does it mean that treaties do not have to be made in pursuance of the Constitution and are not therefore subject to the usual constitutional limitations that apply to acts of Congress? Now, these questions have raised considerable alarm in some circles. Those of you who heard Senator Bricker on this program will remember that he expressed considerable alarm at this trend. Now, Justice Holmes, speaking for the court in the case of Missouri against Holland, talked about this, and he said, "We don't mean to imply that there are no qualifications to the treaty-making power, but they must be ascertained in a different way. It is obvious," he said, "that there may be matters that an act of Congress could not deal with, but that a treaty followed by such an act could, as in the case of the legislation following the Treaty on Migratory Birds." Now, a partial answer to those who fear federal encroachment upon the reserved powers of the states or the rights of individuals under the treaty power was given by the Supreme Court in a case many years ago, the case of Geoffroy against Riggs in 1890. In this case, the court said, and I quote, "The treaty power as expressed in the Constitution is in terms unlimited except by those restraints that are found in the Constitution. It would not be contended," said the court, "that the treaty-making power extends so far as to authorize what the Constitution forbids. But with these exceptions, it is not perceived that there is any limit to the questions which can be adjusted touching any matter which is properly the subject of negotiation with a foreign country, and thus becomes the supreme law of the land." It is significant, I think, that no treaty of the United States or any provision of any treaty has ever been held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States. Now, alarm concerning the scope and effect of the treaty-making power has been intensified by the power of the President to enter into executive agreements with foreign states without the advice and consent of the Senate. During a period from 1789 to 1939, this country entered into some 2,000 international agreements. And of these, 1,200, only 800 of them were treaties. The others were agreements entered into by the President with other countries. This was true of one of the most famous of them in 1817, an agreement, the so-called Rush-Bagot Agreement, which established demilitarization along the whole border of the American-Canadian front, particularly on the Great Lakes. It was this kind of an agreement that established the open door policy in China. It was this kind of an agreement in 1905 that recognized on the part of the United States the Japanese protectorate in Korea. It was this kind of an agreement in 1907 that established what was known as the Gentleman's Agreement to restrict Japanese immigration into this country. In 1917, the Lansing-Ishii Agreement recognized special rights of Japan in China. And I've already mentioned the June 1940 agreement, the so-called Hull-Lothian Agreement on the destroyer exchange. On November 16, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt entered into what came to be known as the Litvinoff Agreement, or the Roosevelt-Litvinoff Agreement, under which he recognized Soviet Russia. And remember that the President receives ambassadors, and he can recognize a state by receiving the ambassador of that state, as Mr. Roosevelt did in this case. And the Roosevelt-Litvinoff Agreement was challenged in two important cases, the United States against Belmont and the United States against Pink, one in 1937, the other in 1947. But in both cases, the Supreme Court of the United States upheld the agreement and said it is as much the supreme law of the land as an act of Congress or a treaty. Now, those who fear the great powers of the federal government and of the president in the increasingly important field of foreign relations were further disturbed by still another decision of the court back in 1936. There had been a war in South America in the so-called Chaco, and the Congress had passed a resolution authorizing the president to forbid the sale of arms to either of the warring states in that affair. And the president, by proclamation, had forbidden American firms to sell arms to either side. The Curtiss Wright Company was indicted and convicted for violating this proclamation of the president. And they argued that the president could not make such a proclamation and Congress could not authorize him to do so. And the court met this issue by saying that the power of the federal government over foreign relations does not depend even on the Constitution of the United States. This is a power which would be vested in the federal government if it had never been mentioned in the Constitution. And that the president, they went on to say, in this vast external realm is the sole voice and has the sole power to speak or listen for the nation. We are here dealing, said the court, not alone with an authority vested in the president, but with an exclusive power of the president as the sole organ of the federal government in the field of international relations, a power which does not require as a basis for its exercise any act of Congress. And I think in this one can see why it is not surprising that those who view with misgiving the increasing involvement of the United States in international affairs should also view with alarm the great powers of the president as the sole organ of the nation in this vast and important area.
This has been a pre-recorded NBC educational production.